This is Kevin Conroy, the voice of Batman. And you're listening to the DCAU Review, hosted by Cal and Liam, streaming at DCAUreview.com and on your favorite podcast app.
Gotham City is out of control.
An entire city screaming in fear.
Supervillains walk the streets, preying on the innocent.
They will learn the true nature of power.
The police are powerless. A creature prowls this urban wasteland.
Who's that?
He moves in darkness. For some, he is a rumor, a name whispered in the corridors of the underworld, waiting for the chance to strike. Let every criminal know the acid taste of fear.
You crazy! Bat! Giant bat!
Gotham has forgotten what justice means. The Dark Knight is here to remind them.
Who are you?
Batman. Good guys wear black.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 154 of the DCAU Review. I am Liam, and with me, as he always is my good brother and my friend and my co-host, Cal. Cal, we are just trotting right along through the month of April, and we're back with another episode of Batman to cover.
That's right. We are back where it all began, where the DCAU began, where you and I began this podcast, where our love for Batman originated. So much greatness started here with Batman the Animated Series. So very excited to continue here in the month of April with more Batman the Animated Series. And Liam, we've had two really good episodes the last 2 weeks that we've covered. So I'm excited to see if that trend continues as we are discussing maybe one of the lesser known or maybe one of those non so pivotal episodes when you're thinking of Batman the Animated Series, but is definitely another plot driven episode. That being, of course, Paging the Crime Doctor.
That's right. There's a lot going on here. No big, colorful supervillains to be seen this week. It's an interesting sort of mob-driven story. Batman really isn't the focus of the story once again this week, as focus is more on this character. But we'll get into all of the specifics of that in our four main categories in just a moment. But first, Cal, I, of course, must kick us off with the official IMDb synopsis for this week's episode.
That's right. And this episode originally aired on September the 17th, 1993 on Fox Kids, which means we are just about to celebrate the 28-year anniversary of this episode's original debut.
That's right. And this episode, Paging the Crime Doctor, was written by four people, believe it or not. Mike Barr, Laren Bright, Randy Rogel, and Martin Pasco, all credited with story on this week's episode. It was directed by Frank Parr, with music by Shirley Walker and animation by Dong Yang. And that synopsis reads as such. Crime boss Rupert Thorne forces his older brother, a doctor, to perform delicate surgery on Rupert, and he kidnaps Dr. Leslie Thompkins to assist.
Whoa, that's a big and add-on there.
A little bit.
That's kind of actually a pivotal point to the plot. So to kind of have it be an afterthought at the end there of like, oh yeah, also he kidnaps Leslie Thompkins in order to make it happen. But yeah, no, that's just a minor plot.
Oh, by the way, yeah, it's only the whole linchpin for the episode. But
right,
yeah, we can jump into plot from there as our synopsis suggests. We open. It's an interesting start to the episode. We have some thugs seemingly stealing some medical equipment. Batman runs afoul of them and is in fact injured in the fight. And from there, we cut to this sort of dingy underground doctor's office where we see this older man, and crime boss Rupert Thorne pays him a visit, and we quickly find out that not only are they brothers, but that Matthew Thorne actually lost his medical license after he apparently lied about taking a bullet out of Rupert Thorne on a previous hospital stay of his, and has sort of been forced to continue his work as a doctor without a license, and is, I guess, sort of just a patch up man for the mob now.
Yeah, the first introduction that we get is Dr. Matthew Thorne is finishing up some work as Rupert Thorne walks in, and it's kind of a throwaway line if you're not really paying attention to it. Something that as a child you probably didn't think twice of, but the person that he's finishing up on mentions that oh, no more fingerprints, Mr. Thorne, or Dr. Thorne. So yeah, he's certainly doing some less than above board stuff when it comes to his medical profession at this point. And yeah, we do learn very quickly that was a direct result of him refusing to sort of compromise, and it's ultimately sort of Rupert Thorne's fault, because Rupert Thorne didn't want to be some of his dealings to be brought to the light based on that, which is why he had his brother take out this bullet undercover. But as they kind of get into it, and that some of the maybe growing animosity that Matthew Thorne has with his brother, despite his brother continuing to bring him in the latest in technology and seemingly funding his underground practice, that also seems to be a little bit self-serving and helping his men and helping him out. Rupert Thorne seems to have a bit of a reaction and maybe a bit of a heart attack.
To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure, Rupert?
I brought you some more equipment, the latest in medical technology. After all, nothing's too good for my brother, the crime doctor.
Oh, great, a laser. For all that critical brain surgery I'll be doing on my distinguished patients.
Still, after all these years, still such contempt.
Now, why would I have contempt for the man who made me what I am today?
How would I know? I'm the fool who keeps giving you everything you want, even though you act like an ungrateful punk.
What I want is to be a real doctor, Rupert, with a respectable practice.
Is it my fault you lost your license?
I would have reported that bullet to the police, as I was supposed to. But no, you insisted.
You knew what I turned into before you took that slug out of me, Matthew.
So for that, I get to spend the rest of my life like this?
I had much bigger plans, and you know it, you vulgar...
Don't you ever talk to me like that! Me, who gave up everything so you could... Oh!
On the table with them, stacked!
In the meantime, we flash to the Thomas Wayne Memorial Free Clinic, where we know that Dr. Leslie Thompkins, friend of Bruce and of Bruce's father, and we actually learn a little bit of her backstory in this. But she was, of course, previously featured in Appointment in Crime Alley, and we knows Batman's secret, and Batman wanders into her office after having this run-in with Rupert Thorne's men, where we find out that Bruce may have had a concussion or two. I think certainly not the first time, and certainly probably not the last time, based on some of the action that we see. But this occurred when one of Rupert Thorne's men used a laser, a medical laser, prototype medical laser, and shot it at him, kind of grazing his head. So we find out that Bruce has sustained a concussion, which comes into play a little bit later on. But there's an interesting interaction that he has with Leslie Thompkins there, and we end up seeing this photo of her and Bruce's father on the wall, and she sort of mentions that Bruce's father always said that he was rather stubborn from a young age.
Yeah, it's a good job, I think, because that helps, I think, to have this episode stand on its own, so that you don't necessarily need to have seen Leslie's previous appearances, like in Appointment in Crime Alley. It's very quickly reestablished that she's an old family friend, and that she's known Bruce for years, that she knows he's Batman, and that she is, as trusted an ally as he has outside of, Alfred and maybe Robin. So I liked that. And then from there, yeah, we through some more expositional dialogue as Rupert Thorne just refuses to go to a hospital to get what we I guess find out is something of a tumor near his heart, and he needs to have it removed by surgery, and is refusing to go to a hospital, and so Matt, the crime doctor, says that the only way he could possibly operate on Rupert in secret would be if he had his old friend Leslie Thompkins help. And so there's they go to her clinic at night as it's closing down, and kidnap her and then take her by force, and she does assist him in saving Rupert Thorne's life, it appears. But we of course, as soon as they're done, then we are dealing with the mob after all, and so they very quickly plan to eliminate her as a witness, and that's sort of when Matt Thorne can no longer take it, and he can no longer kind of deal with the guilt of this, and he can't allow his old friend to be killed, and so he sort of outsmarts the Rupert's thugs and sort of starts to get away, and thankfully by then Batman has sort of begun to intervene, and we get sort of a dramatic ending as they're trying to jump across a rooftop, and Leslie falls only to be caught by Batman at the last second. And it's not a big heavy action story, but it is kind of a fun, thrilling last couple minutes there, and you do have a little bit extra drama, I think, because yeah, these are just regular kind of run-of-the-mill mob guys, but it is Batman's obviously injured coming into the fight. Plus, he has this personal connection to Leslie. So I think it's not just your average, I think that is what the drama is, more than, these guys are such a physical threat to Batman would be. At least not normally they wouldn't be. But I think because you have him coming into the battle injured, and you have Leslie there, that kind of adds to the suspense.
Yeah, it definitely does. And there's a little bit in the first scene that where Matthew Thorne goes to kidnap Leslie. First of all, he makes it known when Rupert Thorne finds out that Matthew has a connection or somebody that resource that he can use to help him. He's very quick to say, well, I'll go get him for you. First of all, very chauvinistic of Rupert Thorne to assume that it was a man. I think that's pretty much a cancelable offense in 2021.
Right.
But anyway, Rupert Thorne thinking, well, I'll go get him. But it's interesting because it's the first kind of glimpse that we get that maybe Matthew Thorne not only begrudgingly is doing this, but is kind of looking for a way out and has more of a heart. While he's kind of torn between wanting to help and save his brother, he also knows that Leslie is the only person that he can trust that can kind of help him, despite apparently not seeing her for many, many years. But he also still cares for her enough to not just send the thugs in on their own. So that's when he goes with them to break in and kidnap her. And he even has a little bit of dialogue where he tries to coerce her to go along with it, quietly and without force. And of course, Leslie being the good soul that she is not interested in any financial compensation and knows what type of strings are attached with mob money, so she isn't interested in that. But there is an interesting interaction between the two of them where you really kind of get this backstory that both Matt and Leslie were in medical school with Thomas Wayne.
Remember when I took this? Big AMA mixer, graduation week at the Waldorf, remember? And they booked Benny Goodman.
Matt Thorne? I'd heard things about you, Matt. The word was you were still practicing. Without a license. I heard other things, too. Looks like most of them are true. Now about this friend in trouble.
It's me. Because of what a certain patient of mine will do to me if I don't operate on him. But I can't do it alone, and he won't let me check him into county.
So you want me to assist? Forget it.
Look, there'll be a lot of money in it for you.
I know what kind of money that is. Get out.
I'm sorry you feel that way.
No. Leave me alone. You can't do this. No.
So you suddenly have this connection between not only Matthew Thorne and Leslie, but also this connection between Bruce and Matthew Thorne that Bruce doesn't quite realize until he and Alfred go to investigate the break-in at Leslie's clinic, and they see this inscription that he's put on the back, or this inscription that's been written on this back of Leslie Thompkins and Thomas Wayne, which, by the way, that picture, do you think that was insinuating in some way that maybe Thomas Wayne and Leslie Thompkins had a thing at one point?
You know, I hadn't really thought about that, but I mean, it's a possibility. I mean, because they never really implied that the Thorne and Leslie thing was romantic, and not as if, you know, men and women can't be friends or colleagues or whatever. But yeah, I do wonder that there was clearly she was a very close to that family, and yeah, I think that could be a little bit of an implication there.
Not that there was anything going on post, you know,
Thomas
I
got
Martha getting together, but it's interesting that photo looked, at least the way that it was drawn, the photo of them looked very cozy together. And
yeah,
it's interesting. Bruce asks Alfred specifically if he remembered a mat, and Alfred actually, much like last week's episode, is sort of Bruce's sounding board to kind of put things together as he's sort of doing his detective work. And Alfred says that he does recall that Thomas had mentioned to Matthew at one point, and that they were colleagues and called themselves the Three Musketeers between the three of them. So very, very interesting. Maybe it was all completely platonic, but maybe headcanon says that Thomas and Leslie had some romantic relations beforehand, and that's why she felt such a close connection with Bruce, not in a romantic way, but just in a caring, loving way, and why that friendship went beyond the grave for Thomas and Martha. So yeah, a little bit of headcanon there, but yeah, I think it's interesting because you're right, there isn't a whole lot of action. There's a couple of that opening scene actually, I think has a lot of action in it, and but then it is a very dialogue heavy driven conversation between both the Thorne brothers, and then Matthew Thorne and Leslie, and then Bruce and Leslie, and Alfred and Bruce, and then we get a little bit of action towards the end as Bruce has to come in and take on the thugs, and then again it's the little bit of drama at the end and action that takes place is based on the sort of tension of, is Leslie gonna fall from the top of this building? So yeah, it's not action packed, but I think that this is another case of one of those episodes where, watching it as a child, it definitely was not one of my favorite episodes. But I think watching it now through adult eyes and recognizing what an interesting story, you know, to have a guy who basically gave up his career in order to defend, you know, to keep his brother's secret safe. He cares for his brother so much, he decided to give up his career to protect him. So he kind of has this misplaced love and affection for his brother, and a sense of owing something to him. And then, but then realizes, he has this conversation at the end when he's kind of faced with choosing this career, getting his career back, the thing that he's been wanting so badly for this period of time, ever since he lost his license, and putting somebody else's life in its place, and trading a life for his license. He even has this conversation with Leslie once he kind of decides that he's not going to kill Leslie, and he instead administers the sedative to one of Thorne's men. He even tells Leslie that a life is not worth his license. It's not worth training. And she has this really affirmative statement where she says, "Now you're talking like a doctor."
Don't worry, it's just a sedative. We've got to get you out of here. Come on, this way.
What about your brother? Your license?
Forget it. It's not worth someone's life.
Now you're talking like a doctor.
I thought that was really, really great. And then the very end of the episode, Liam, we didn't even really get to touch on that just yet before we get into our scores here. But at the very end of the episode, there's this great visual transition that we'll talk about in just a second in visuals, Liam. But we go from Matthew Thorne being on the roof to him being in this interrogation room at the police station, and Bruce walks in. Bruce Wayne happens to walk in and introduces himself to Matthew Thorne and says that he's willing to help him out with his legal expenses, and but he wants something in exchange. And of course, Matthew Thorne assumes at this point that it's something underhanded and says that he's not interested, but that's not what Bruce is looking for.
Yeah, no, I think that's this ending is, I think, one of the best endings to any episode that we've ever reviewed. I genuinely felt that when I watched it.
Visitor Thorne.
Bruce Wayne, Dr. Thorne. Thomas Wayne's son. Did you get my letter?
Yes. Thomas Wayne.
I told you I can help you with your legal costs. Maybe even put in a good word with the judge.
Yes, but what do you get out of it?
Well, there is something you can do for me.
I knew it. I knew there'd be a catch. Sorry, Mr. Wayne. Matthew Thorne is no longer for sale.
I'm not looking for any illegal favors.
What then?
Something you know. Something only you can give me. Tell me about my father.
I think that's something we've talked about a lot with probably Batman Beyond more than anything else, that sometimes the endings are very sudden or a little bit flat, and they just don't have that nice wrap up that maybe we're looking for. But this episode in particular, it's such a great thing because throughout the whole episode, we're sort of painted this picture of Matthew Thorne as this, he wasn't necessarily a bad person, but he made a decision, out of deference to his brother that cost him his profession. And he made a series of questionable decisions ever since, all leading to that moment where he chooses not to let Thorne's men kill Leslie, and he finally chooses in that moment to make the right decision. So we're kind of painting this picture, and as you mentioned, we get that backstory, we get the exposition about him and Thomas and Leslie being great friends at medical school. So we have all of that backstory. So when we get to that scene and Bruce asks him for a favor in exchange for perhaps helping out with his legal troubles, Matt Thorne is understandably a little bit concerned and doesn't want to get involved with another, he doesn't want to trade one master for another one, so to speak. And Bruce instead says that, he doesn't want anything illegal from him, doesn't even want anything medical from him at all. And in fact, he just wants him to tell him about his father. And the whole, and again, we'll get to this a little bit in visuals too, but the whole energy of the scene changes as Matt's guard is up kind of the whole time as he's waiting for the shoe to drop with whatever this rich playboy wants from him. And then when he finally figures out that all he wants is to, hear some stories about his dad, it's really quite powerful and emotional, and it becomes this very kind of warm ending, and it's a really sweet ending to the story, and it's a really truly beautiful, vulnerable moment for Bruce Wayne that I don't necessarily know that we get to see all that often. Where and it's such a sweet moment, and it seems like a nice little happy ending where, yes, this man that we've been following for this episode made a lot of terrible choices, but it goes back to one of Rupert Thorne's earliest appearances in an episode we covered. It's never too late, right? You can always choose to be a good person, even if you weren't yesterday, if you weren't for every other day of your life, you can still choose to change that and turn that life around. And Bruce Wayne sort of being a way to help this guy in exchange for giving him some stories about his father is such a sweet ending to this story, and I really loved it.
Yeah, it's a great redemption arc for a guy who starts out the literal beginning that we see him. He's doing something shady to try and help the mob, and a guy not have fingerprints the next time he gets involved in something he shouldn't be, that he could be held accountable for. And then at the very end, he's helping someone heal. Like he's not actually doing surgery. He's not actually doing something that a doctor, you would think a traditional doctor, a medical doctor would do, but he's helping to heal Bruce and helping him have this connection with his dad, that, stories about his dad that he may have never heard, or a time where he didn't know his father, or pieces of his past that are missing with that. So really, really great. Yeah. For all those reasons, Liam, as we get into our scores here for our plot, I really enjoyed this episode. It is a little bit light on action. So because of that, it's not bad. I think it's very well done, and the story really drives it. And it's a pretty good story. It's not perfect, but I think it's a really good story overall. For all those reasons, I ended up giving plot a 8 out of 10. What about you?
Nice. Yeah, I'm just a little bit higher there at a 9 out of 10. I think the ending is what brings it up for me, because it does show that redemption for this person who, again, wasn't truly evil. He wasn't this heinous monster, but he did clearly do a lot of bad things and questionable things. And as you said, he chooses to now uses his powers for good, so to speak. And I think it's a really powerful ending, and that's kind of what brought my score up a little bit more. All right, Cal, and that will move us on to our visuals and animation section this week. Once again, this episode was directed by Frank Parr with animation by Dong Yang. Like we said, not a action heavy episode, but what stood out to you from a visual department?
Yeah, it's not a ton of action beats here, but that didn't mean that there weren't some really awesome Batman moments. I think that very opening scene, as we have the thugs, Rupert Thorne's thugs, are knocking over an armored truck that is transporting this prototype laser, as we talked about, medical laser. That is an interesting scene, because they actually use a ambulance in order to knock over this truck. So it's that in and of itself is an interesting tool for them to use, and kind of gives you the right off the bat here, the crime doctor is involved. But then Batman kind of running alongside in a very sneakily fashion as they're trying to get away in the shadows. There's a cut to Batman running alongside on the bridge in the shadows, and you just kind of see the whites of the eyes and a little bit of the outline of his cape. I thought, what a great way to introduce Batman to this episode. And there's some hijinks that then later ensues as he jumps on top of the ambulance, and then at one point they try and run him over. He jumps on the hood, and his cape ends up blinding them, so they end up crashing into the side of the bridge. So lots of fun right from the get-go in that opening scene. And we do see what appears to be Batman dying, which is interesting, but he of course lands on a cable car that just happens to be going past, and lucky for him. But that was one of the visuals that I thought that stuck out. Batman's cape looking pretty cool. I think that qualifies for hashtag cape movement, right? With the cape blocking the windshield.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely qualifies. That is a cool little sequence here, and that's one of those gags that I knew I had seen before, but I couldn't remember if this was the first place I had seen that done, where he uses the cape to block the guy's view and kind of causes the car to crash. It's one of those things where in addition to he wears this outfit to strike fear and all that, I like the idea that he finds like functional reasons to have a big flowing cape that goes all the way to his ankles.
An ostentatious accessory like a cape. Yes, I agree. So that was the first one. I will say that most of the characters here, this is more of the square jawed Batman than it is the big droopy nose, swoop back ears Batman. I thought everybody for the most part looked on model. This Rupert Thorne this week decided to have whites behind his eyes for the entirety of the episode. But they were able to keep that pretty consistent throughout the episode from what I noticed. And everybody else seemed to be mostly on model. They did seem a little bit stiff at times, some of the characters in the way of their movements, but I guess that's a little bit of nitpicking there. There was, I thought there was a cute moment when Batman goes to Leslie's free clinic to get checked up, and as Batman is coming in, there's a young family that is in Leslie's office, and as she's ushering them out, there's a child who's pointing very, very fervently at Batman's shadow, trying to get his mom's attention, and his mom, of course, paying him no mind. But I thought that was a cute little thing there to show just how the kid had noticed Batman, but the mom wasn't paying him no attention. Always interesting when the kids get to interact with Batman. But then I thought that the next visuals that we really kind of were notable would come from when Batman is interacting with this thug that looked a little bit like the great Nostromos's assistant from one of our past episodes, but it was not. I guess maybe it was not him, but he's throwing scalpels at Batman after Batman has sort of re-aggravated his concussion. Also, a closed fist punch. They snuck that one past standards and practices. It's a punch that connects, but there's sort of like a flash that occurs, so I guess you don't technically see the punch connect. The thug punches Batman. So that sort of reactivates his concussion symptoms. So we start to see double and triple of this thug that's hurling scalpels at Batman. Very interesting there. And then I think that the main highlight, I think, as far as action sequences are concerned, happened in a very split second, but was another one of those moments where I was ready to punch the sky, because there's a scene where Leslie and Matthew Thorne are running away from the additional Thorne thugs. They run into an elevator, and as they escape them, the elevator goes up and the thugs are kind of left there banging the door, and they notice that the other elevator to the right all of a sudden is coming up. And as the doors open, who's standing there in the shadows? But of course, the Dark Knight himself, and more fighting ensues as he attacks the gentleman right there. But I thought that was a neat gimmick. The Batman coming out of the elevator completely in the shadow, to the surprise of much to the surprise of the thugs, I thought was a great little bit there that I thoroughly enjoyed.
Yeah, there's definitely some cool Batman stuff. A little more, because he's been concussed. He's a little more gadget focused in the final fight. We see him use smoke bombs. We see him kind of sticking to the shadows, and rather than kind of entering a fist fight as the one larger thug with the Tommy gun is opening fire on. People like to make jokes about stormtroopers in Star Wars having bad aim. But this guy, he pretty much has Leslie dead to rights, and somehow he doesn't have and his gun is just continuously firing, and somehow you can't hit her even once. But
nope, not once.
But yeah, Batman, rather than kind of engaging in fisticuffs, just ties him up with the rope at his ankles and kind of pulls him, and his head slams into the ground and kind of knocks him out that way. And then we got what I think is probably the best animation of the episode, which is when Leslie tries to leap across the building and it doesn't quite make it, and Thorne is kind of reaching out, holding her hand, and she kind of slips out of his grip, and we get this POV shot of Batman jumping off the building, his hands extend, he has the grappling hook as he swoops down, grabs her, fires the grappling hook, catches her and swings her to safety. And as you mentioned, there's a great transition at that point where it pans up to Matt Thorne on the rooftop looking down, and that sort of transitions into that final scene of now he's sort of seated in like an interrogation room, just with his hands clasped on the table the way that they were on the edge of the roof in the previous scene. So a good little bit of symmetry there. And then, like I said, just I love as much as that is very much a story and voice acting moment. The body language of that final scene, like I said, of Matt Thorne being so guarded and kind of ready for the shoe to drop, and then the way Bruce kind of walks up to him, his shoulders are a little bit slumped, and he kind of looks up to him in a very, for lack of a better term, I think a very innocent and childlike way. And
for sure,
with so much kind of a mixture of sadness and hope in his eyes, just says, tell me about my father. And at that moment, you see the crime doctor's body language completely changed and becomes much more warm and sort of fatherly to Bruce at that point, and puts his arm around him, and they sort of slowly walk to the table, and you see them, they're both smiling now, and you see him sort of gesturing as he's beginning to tell the story, whatever story. So it's even though that is such a visual or it's much more of, I think, of a story beat or a voice acting moment normally, I thought the way they sort of interpreted everything, from the body language to the way Bruce asks the question, the visuals really even enhanced that scene as well.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely spot on with that. And we'll talk in a second when we move into music, because music plays a very pivotal role in that as well. But there is no dialogue. It's just the sort of this realization that Matthew Thorne has, that he's, for the last however many years he's been doing this. And even before then, before he lost his license, he was doing things on behalf of other people that ended up costing him, that really cost him a lot. He sacrificed for the better part of the last several years, maybe his morals and what he originally intended to do as he was coming out of medical school, to take that oath to help people and to help heal people and help people overcome sickness and all of that. And here he is, kind of at a point in his life where he's older, and he's realized that his life isn't what he had hoped it was. And there's even a contrast, almost a subtle contrast in the story between what he's doing and what Leslie is doing. He's doing this underground, underhanded, stuff for the mob, for the lowest of the low, crime boss and for the people that are ruining the city. And here's Leslie, who came out of the same medical school and the same trio of people, and she's running a free clinic in the slums of Gotham for the low income families and for the homeless, and as we've seen in her other in the other episode featuring her. So it's really an interesting contrast between where they ended up in life, and then at the end here, for him to have this opportunity to have redemption, and there's no dialogue for it. It's simply all done in the way that the character was drawn, and the way that he sort of reacts. It's such a great way to kind of punctuate that full redemption from where he started to where he ends up in this episode. So I wholeheartedly agree. The fact that there was no dialogue needed for that it was done completely visually, and then with the music that we'll talk about in a minute, just really, really fantastic.
Agreed. And for all those reasons, Cal, I ended up, despite not having a tremendous amount of action in the episode, I still came up with a very strong 8 out of 10 for my visual score.
Nice. Yeah, I gave the exact same score. I think the things that we talked about were strong enough to really carry an episode that was more story driven, and that had more reliance on dialogue and even some of the music points that we'll talk about in just a moment. But it's very, very, very strong still. The parts that they needed to be visually impactful, I think were, and even without having those heavy battle scenes, or as we said at the beginning, not a brightly colored villain, or and a crazy scheme that's happening, to threaten the city of Gotham. It's more of that lower level story, that the understated story that lies heavier on the story itself rather than the visuals, but still very, very strong.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And from one strong category to another, we move on to music. Music this week done by the late great Shirley Walker. And because this episode is so character driven, Cal, music does not necessarily drive it the way it does in certain other episodes. However, when the music comes in to punctuate certain scenes, actually right at the start when the title card first appears, there's a pretty dramatic theme. Some of the music when Rupert Thorne and Matt are talking to each other, and then when Leslie is kidnapped, it's very good at building atmosphere. But there's one specific moment near the end again that I want to talk about that reminded me of a previous episode. But what stood out to you from a musical standpoint this week?
Yeah, I had a lot of notes actually from music. I think you're right, that first scene with both the heist and then Batman swooping in. There's a strong theme that ends up playing pretty heavily throughout the episode that returns again when Matthew and Rupert Thorne are talking, and then again in the scene with where Matthew Thorne goes to Leslie Thompkins' clinic, and so there is a reoccurring theme that plays several times there, and really drives the music, and it's one that, again, this was not an episode that I would categorize as one of my favorites growing up. But as soon as I heard the theme, and this has been an episode that I probably have not seen in several years at this point, so going back and revisiting it, it was a theme that I recalled. It was a theme that stuck in my head and was like, oh yeah, this is that episode. So for that to stick in my head for an episode that I hadn't seen very often and wasn't a favorite, I think speaks to the level of the impact of the music, and it just punctuates the scenes and creates the emotional punch that it needs to when it's called upon. The dread and the terror as Leslie realizes that these men are breaking into her clinic, and then when she's being forcibly kidnapped to come help this old friend of hers perform surgery on his brother, the tension is kind of built through that. And there's some filler music where in Bruce fighting, when Batman's fighting the thug that's trying to throw the scalpels at him and then hit him with the laser, and especially I think the scene when Leslie's trying to jump across the roof, the music plays up in those scenes too. But I think we probably both had the same note, as you sort of alluded to in that final scene there. The music sort of calls back to a previous episode.
Yeah, so the episode that came to mind for me is Nothing to Fear. It's the third episode of the series, at least in production order. It's the third episode we ever reviewed for our show. And of course, that whole episode is based around, because of the fear toxin from the Scarecrow, Batman is having these visions of his father telling him he's a disgrace and telling him that he's shaming the name of the family. And it all sort of comes to this, triumphant conclusion where he conquers his fear and he vanquishes the villain. But the very final scene of that episode is this incredibly dark, sad ending where it's dark and cloudy and windy, and Bruce Wayne is in an overcoat with sunglasses on, and he is standing at his parents' grave. And the musical cue in that episode, it starts out with a little bit of flute music, and then the strings kind of are brought in underneath of it, and we hear the Batman theme played very somberly. And as Bruce walks away, the shadow cast has bat ears. It's a very dramatic, beautiful moment. And so at the end of this episode, the flute starts out very similarly again, and it seems like we're building to that exact same crescendo. But this time, the Batman theme is played much more jovially, and it's because this episode is a much more happy ending where Bruce is getting a little bit more of a connection to his parents, specifically to his father in this episode. And the way that they kind of took that similar feeling of Bruce being reminded of this great tragedy, the tragedy that drove him to become Batman originally, that drives everything that he does, to have that same musical theme be kind of brought back. And it's the familiar Batman theme, but to be played in seemingly such a similar way, but then to sort of tweak it just a little bit to give it a little more sense of hope, a little more sense of optimism, to fit this happier ending, I thought was such a brilliant piece of music and a brilliant idea from the greatest of the greats when it comes to superhero composers in my mind, and that's of course Shirley Walker. But what a brilliant idea to kind of take that similar musical cue but just sort of tweak it to make it a bit more hopeful and a bit happier.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's a great callback, and it's one of those things that it fits the episode. As we said, it fits that final scene. It fits that sort of redemptive story for Matthew Thorne and Bruce, who, it isn't touched upon very heavily in the scene, but you can tell that when he sees the photo of Thomas Wayne and Leslie Thompkins on her wall, he's sort of drawn to it. And in the very first scene where Bruce wanders into her clinic and she makes mention of Thomas always saying that Bruce was stubborn from such a young age, you can kind of sense that longing that Bruce has, that longing to connect to his father, whom he lost at such a very young age. So the fact that final scene plays that, it very much completes and punctuates that redemption arc for Matthew. But also, like you said, the fact that Bruce now has this, it very well bookends that kind of opening scene, or that first scene where Thomas is mentioned, where he sort of longingly looks at this photo, desiring to have this connection, and like you said, having that callback to that episode where that whole Nothing to Fear, which you can hear in the archives at DCAUreview.com, is, as you mentioned, is all about Bruce feeling like he's a disappointment to his father. So there's a broken connection there. There's a wondering, would his father be proud of who he is? So even though that was sort of resolved in that episode, as you mentioned, there's still that, it's still tragic. His father is not here to say that he's proud of him. So he's still longing for that. So for Matthew to kind of have this redemptive story arc, and for it to punctuate that scene with absolutely no dialogue from that point where Bruce asks for Matthew's help, man, it's just goosebump inducing. If you know the connection to the Nothing to Fear episode, it means even more, as we are kind of talking about here. It means more to us as we've reviewed these episodes and know that musical cue, so you can point to it, say, oh my gosh, that's the Nothing to Fear musical cue. But even without it, even if you didn't recognize it, or if you haven't seen that episode in a long time, I feel like it's just a beautiful piece that incorporates the Batman theme and makes it feel just like a warm ending. I remember from watching that as a child, you see him Matthew Thorne kind of gesturing and feeling very warm, and that it is a warm and fuzzy type of feeling, despite the fact that that this is Bruce trying to connect with his dead father. It's a beautiful piece. It's done so incredibly well, Liam. It's the rest of the music throughout the episode, I think, is so strong as well, in the places that it's needed. The Batman theme is played triumphantly, especially when he saves Leslie falling off of the roof. It's great. We've been really blessed with a lot of great music over the last couple episodes here as we've returned to Batman the Animated Series. But this episode in particular, really, really strong, especially with that piece. And I felt like with that piece alone, I had no choice but to give music a perfect 10 out of 10. What about you?
Nice. Yeah, I am right there with you with the exact same score. I also gave it a 10 out of 10. Like I said, I think the music throughout the episode is great at sort of building tension of adding to these moments, and there's none more perfect a moment in there than that last musical cue that we've just talked about. So absolutely well deserving, and just tremendous stuff, and definitely one that I want to make sure that I go, as much as I enjoyed listening to it just in the episode. It's one that I'm like, I'm gonna need to go on Spotify and listen to just the soundtrack by itself this week as well, because it's just it really does, just the music alone evoked such strong emotions from me from what would already have been a pretty emotional scene. So great stuff in the music department this week. But Cal, that will bring us to our final category, and that is, of course, voice acting. And it's interesting. This is sort of the reverse of normal, where we have plenty of players, none of them particularly in large roles, but we have a lot of notable guest voice actors in those small roles. So I'm gotta list a few off here. Some of the various thugs here playing Hoffman. We have Roger Bumpus, who folks would know best as Squidward from SpongeBob SquarePants.
What do you know?
Yeah, veteran voice actor, but obviously there have been very few cartoons in the history of the world that have had, I think, the impact, at least in the United States, that SpongeBob has, as far as, multiple generations of children growing up on it now. So it was really funny to see that name pop up in there. We have a former SNL castmate, Gary Kroger, as Beecham. And then playing the thug Chubb, we have a DCAU veteran, although I guess at this point he had not played those other roles yet, and that is, of course, George Dunza. Of course, not only played Scarface and the ventriloquist in this series, but also, of course, goes on to play Perry White in Superman the Animated Series. So that one was a little distracting, just because he's basically doing the Scarface voice.
Good work, Doc. Me and the boys will take it from here. With the old lady, I mean.
Thank you, Tony, but I'd rather see Dr. Thompkins home myself.
Sorry, Doc, you don't understand. We can't let her talk about this place, see? Before he went under, Mr. Thorne said to us, when it's over, make sure you shut her up.
Yeah, it was hard to not. Yeah, it's hard to not hear. I was like, this is not right.
And he probably has the most dialogue of any of the thugs in the episode. Again, not his fault. It's not that he did anything wrong. It's just when you know the voice so well, it's a little distracting. But and then our main guest characters, we have Diana Mulder returning as Leslie Thompkins, who doesn't get quite as much dialogue, I think, as her first appearance back in Appointment in Crime Alley. But like I said, I really like the first scene where Batman comes to her clinic injured, and she's both warm but sort of she has something of a lecturing tone, but you can tell it's a very familial relationship that these two have. And when she's telling him about how his father always talked about him having a hard head and being stubborn and all of that, and I liked her in this episode, and the way her composure completely changes when she realizes that it's Matt Thorne coming to see her, and she sort of is aware he has a reputation of being this crime doctor, so she's not exactly thrilled to see him. And then just after the surgery, she's not surprised when it appears that they're coming to shut her up. So I think she does a pretty good job in this episode as well.
Yeah, I think that she comes across just kind of being world weary, and both in her interactions with Bruce and then later with Matthew Thorne, but her sort of I would say trying to get through to Matthew Thorne a little bit, and then kind of being pleasantly surprised once he kind of reveals that he's come to his senses and is kind of back on the good side. I thought that was done pretty well.
Agreed. And we have, of course, John Vernon returning as Rupert Thorne, although briefly, as obviously he has this health condition, and we don't actually see him post the surgery in this episode. So we do get the scene with him and the actor playing Matt Thorne, or the crime doctor, Joseph Campanella. I like that first interaction there. That feels like something out
great chemistry.
it feels like out of Goodfellas or something. Like,
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
real. It's straight out of like a mob movie. That first scene of the brothers arguing. The one brother who was trying to live this noble life as a doctor, who was sort of dragged down into the mud by his brother's criminal organization and all that. And there's this contempt, but at the same time, when it's clear that Rupert's life is in danger, you do see Matt, they're still brothers at the end of it, and Matt still does care for him, and ultimately is willing to do more evil or bad things to save his brother. So it's a really interesting dynamic, even though they don't share that many scenes together.
Yeah, and I think the difference between Rupert and Matthew, like Rupert is so over the top and very dramatic in the way that he delivers all of his lines, and puts sort of an emphasis on every word that he's saying and coming out of his mouth is this powerful word from a mob boss, and the way that Matthew's dialogue is much more understated. It's much more calm, and even in the face of this idea that he might have to come up with a plan to try and outwit his brother's thugs so that he doesn't kill this doctor. Like, he's very calm and he's very collected, and which makes sense for a doctor that has to go into surgery, despite you got to keep your cool and your calm under pressure. So I really like the difference in the dynamic between the two of them. It really kind of sets them apart in kind of their personalities and in the way that they did that. I believe you said Mr. Campanella had quite the long history of acting, but nothing of like cultural relevance. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, he was on a show called One Day at a Time for several years. He was on a show called Mannix for several years, like multiple shows.
Some soap operas I saw, I think,
as well as some other guest spots on even into his later years. He's sadly no longer with us, but yeah, he was a kind of a character actor, I guess you would say. He kind of popped up here and there, and I guess had some TV and film roles. Although most famously, I think in our wheelhouse, he was the voice of Kurt Connors, aka the Lizard, on we're gonna have to do a bonus episode on it someday. maybe next April Fool's Day or something. But Spider-Man, the animated series from 1994, he was Dr. Kurt Connors on that show, and it's one of those things where I kind of recognized the voice, but I wasn't sure from where. And then Correct. I was looking at the IMDb page for him, and I saw that. I went, oh, yep, that's it. There it is. So I think he does a fine job. I don't think, like I said, I think his best work is that first scene with Rupert Thorne and then that with John Vernon, and then that final scene with Kevin Conroy. Again, I keep coming back to it because it was such a perfect scene. But again, the guarded nature of his voice in that final scene. And up to kind of, again, that's sort of the last few words of the episode that he utters are very sort of defiant and angry. And then when Kevin Conroy, in like I said, a very sort of sheepish, childlike way, asks him, tell me about my father. It's such a beautiful way to end the episode. And Kevin Conroy, again, doesn't have a ton to do in this episode because it focuses so much on this crime doctor and Leslie and Rupert Thorne to a lesser extent. But like I said, I really enjoyed the first scene with him and Diana Mulder as Leslie, and then that final little bit there with him it's also something where I think a lot of times the Bruce Wayne voice that Kevin Conroy does, especially in these original episodes, a lot of times it's played for comedy because, like, well, we know how he actually talks and he doesn't talk like this. But like him being able to communicate like honesty and vulnerability while still doing the Bruce Wayne voice. Like, I know it's not breaking news here on this show 154 episodes in, but like I was marveling at that line delivery because I'm like, he doesn't go into the Batman voice. It's not like he completely pulls the facade down.
Right.
He's still being public figure Bruce Wayne in that moment, but it's so deeply earnest and honest when he asks him, when he says, "Tell me about my father," that I was like, how did he do that?
Yeah, breaking news: Kevin Conroy, really good. It's really it's done really well. There's even, I think, even an interaction between him and the brief appearance that we get from Ephraim Zimbalist Jr.'s Alfred. I think there's some good dialogue there that sort of continues where we kind of left off last week with Mudslide. Which of course you can hear in the archives if you didn't check that out. But yeah, I think that Kevin Conroy doesn't have a lot to do in this episode. It is very much more on Mr. Campanella's shoulders to carry the episode. And for the record, I think he does a pretty good job for what he's asked to do. And it's a little bit understated at times, but I think that's the character. But I think you're right. The nuance of Bruce's, or of Kevin Conroy's performance of Bruce in that final scene is really great. I love picking up on that sort of like that little bit of what we know about the character and kind of like looking at that and seeing that this is genuine Bruce, but still Bruce facade. I love that. Love pointing that out. But I think the performances for this week's voices are really great. I think that Mr. Campanella did a very good job. But there isn't a whole lot other than that scene with Rupert Thorne where he really had to sort of evoke much emotion, and so most of it goes onto Kevin Conroy's shoulders for those brief scenes that he's in. But for all of those reasons, I ended up giving voice acting a very strong 9 out of
10. And I gave it the exact same score of 9 out of 10.
Nice.
At this point, I will once again remind the listeners that we do not discuss our stores. We do not plan this, but it does tend to happen more often than not. We usually end up similar, if not the exact same, on quite a few of these. But definitely some great vocal performances. And I believe that will begin to wrap us up and bring us to our final scores this week, Cal. And tallying everything up, I have a very strong final score of 36 out of 40.
That's right. And while I did consider giving a bonus point for another, I will just shout it out. I'm not going to give it for the third week in a row, but yet another great title card for this week's episode. I did consider it, but I was like, I'm gonna lay off giving a bonus point for this week, because while you could arguably give it, I'm not going to this week. But another great one. Go out of your way to take a look at it. I think everything from the text, that's a very pulpy 1930s, 1940s pulp comic, or one of those noir detective story comic books that got the Comic Authority Code created, sort of text across the top of it, or a pulpy C-list movie of the 1940s or 50s, sort of text overlaid, this very creepy outline of a doctor's face, holding a syringe. So very interesting. I think that my score ended up being a 35 out of 40, so just a notch below your 36 out of 40. But I guess talking about rewatchability here, Liam, in the grand scheme of the DCAU, of Batman the Animated Series, this isn't as impactful, I think, because we're going to link this a little bit to Nothing to Fear based on some of the story here. Maybe link it to Appointment in Crime Alley with some of the characters being played here. Maybe It's Never Too Late with some of the story, the way that the story goes, and the redemption of it, and the heaviness, and the less supervillain centric and more character driven story. But where do you land as far as I'm struggling on? I don't think this is a must watch, but I think it's an enjoyable watch, and it's one that I would definitely recommend to somebody if you're looking to recommend a non-traditional, like, beat 'em up bad guy story.
Yeah, it's just kind of a head and the heart are fighting on this one for me, because heart definitely says this is must watch just for that final scene alone. But no, in the grand scheme of things, Leslie obviously is a reoccurring character, but appears in other episodes, and they kind of give you her backstory in those episodes as well, so you don't need to watch it for that. Rupert Thorne appears in many other episodes, and he's a mob boss. You don't need a lot of context beyond that. And the character of Matt Thorne never returns. So it's hard to say that this is must watch, especially if we're talking about the grand scope of the entire DCAU. But man, it's so good. It's such a good, strong episode, and it ends on such a high note that it's tough for me to say that you don't have to watch this one. But I'll settle on that. I think it's great. I think you should, but I can't say that you have to, if that makes sense.
No, I agree with that. And one thing we didn't mention as we were kind of getting into the plot or even an introduction here, but one thing that I found interesting is this was a villain. The crime doctor was a villain that actually has been used in standard DC continuity since Detective Comics number 77, I believe, was when he made his original debut. Matthew Thorne did. He's credited as being created by Bill Finger and Bob Kane. So it's interesting. This character has such a rich, deep history, and sort of regained some of his popularity or usage in the DC continuity right after the post Crisis on Infinite Earths world and continuity in standard DC Comics. So that of course taking place just a few years before Batman the Animated Series relaunch. So it's interesting that they took this sort of lesser known DC character, and because they had already established Rupert Thorne as a villain in this series, kind of using this long-standing villain that you might not know very much about, which I feel like the DCAU did so well with, and certainly some of these Batman the Animated Series episodes, the writers were able to take some of those older DC characters and certainly Batman characters, the Hugo Stranges, certainly, as we've talked about it numerous times, Mr. Freeze, some of these lesser known characters or afterthoughts, and really turn them into interesting characters that you can actually build an actual realistic story around. So more kudos to the four writers and certainly the team over at that produced this, because taking a crime doctor and making it sort of grounded in reality was no easy feat.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a fun, wacky little character. It's a very like Grant Morrison thing to do, to take this like wacky golden age character and ground them and make them like an integral part of a story like this. So it was
for sure.
It was a cool, deep cut character to bring into the show. But yeah, that'll begin to wrap us up. Thank you so much to everyone for listening, whether you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, on DCAUreview.com, or any of your other podcast apps, or of course, if you prefer to consume your podcasts via YouTube, you can always check us out on the Pod Tower YouTube channel. We are there along with our friends from Tim Talk, as well as the Watchtower database, and you can always check us out there. Go ahead and give us a subscribe. Even if you don't use it, we could use the subscribers. So we'd love if you could go up there and subscribe. Because again, it's not just our content; you get some great content from our friends as well. So definitely check that out as well. And Cal, we've got some exciting plans for May, but before we get there, we have one final episode of Batman to review next week, in the last week of April, that will actually kind of serve as a linchpin to our special month of May. And we will be talking about one of the first big DC hero crossover appearances in the history of the DCAU, because next week we are reviewing a little episode called Zatanna.
That is right, Liam. Maybe one at the time. As a child, we did not appreciate as a crossover, and not really knowing the depth of the DCAU. But one of those crossovers that the writers snuck in early on, and it is certainly, from my recollection, a very memorable, important episode. It does broaden the horizons a little bit. We deal with a little bit of magic. We learn a little bit about Bruce's past and some romances and It's going to be loads of fun, as you mentioned and alluded to, that we'll talk to next week. That is going to be a launching point for our May coverage, which we will discuss on next week's episode. Can't wait to do that.
Absolutely, and we can't wait to get to that episode and beyond. But until then, I'm Liam.
And I'm Cal.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of the DCAU Review.
Bye-bye.